Welcome back, dear listener, to Religious Stories for Sleep. I'm genuinely delighted you've returned, though I suspect it's less about my sparkling personality and more about the fact that you're desperate for something, anything, to stop your mind from rehearsing tomorrow's anxieties or replaying that embarrassing thing you said in 2007. Either way, I'm here for you, and I promise to be far more boring than your racing thoughts. Tonight, we're journeying to ancient and medieval India to explore a religious life so all-encompassing, so intricately woven into every breath and heartbeat, that our modern concept of religion as a Sunday morning activity would seem laughably quaint. We're talking about Hinduism, not as a belief system you could simply adopt or discard, but as the very fabric of existence itself, a cosmic order that determined when you woke, what you ate, whom you could touch, and whether your soul would ascend or return as something significantly less appealing, perhaps a dung beetle. The universe had opinions about your life choices. Now, before you start thinking this will be some sort of spiritual journey of self-discovery, let me stop you right there. This is a sleep podcast. The only thing you should be discovering is the back of your eyelids. We're going to explore the crushing weight of religious obligation, the extraordinary privilege of the priestly class, and the absolutely relentless nature of ritual purity in a way that is historically accurate, deeply detailed, and, I cannot stress this enough, profoundly, soothingly tedious. We'll walk through 4 distinct aspects of Hindu religious life. First, the brutal daily reality of being a temple servant, where you'd discover that spiritual devotion and backbreaking labor were essentially the same thing. Second, the life of a devout king who had to balance cosmic duty with the occasionally inconvenient need to run an actual kingdom. Third, the fascinating and slightly maddening world of ancient Hindu texts, where meanings were lost, found, debated, and lost again. And finally, the stark hierarchy between priests and everyone else, a gap so wide you could fit several castes in between. So settle in, adjust your pillow, take a deep breath, and prepare to feel extraordinarily grateful that you were born in an era where you can eat leftover pizza for breakfast without consulting an ancient text about ritual purity. Before we drift into the past, though, I do have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy these nocturnal historical wanderings, please do subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about which historical period has successfully bored you to sleep, and give this video a like. Think of it as a tiny act of devotion, far less demanding than what we're about to explore, and requiring no dawn bathing in cold rivers whatsoever. Now let us begin. Imagine yourself, though honestly, I'd rather you didn't imagine too vividly, as that defeats the purpose of sleep, waking, in complete darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, where you can roll over and check your phone to see it's 3 a.m. and you have 4 more hours of potential sleep, but genuine, profound darkness. No electricity, naturally. No streetlights filtering through your curtains. Just darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, the sound of a bell. Not a pleasant bell. Not a wind chime tinkling in a gentle breeze. This is a bronze bell, struck with purpose, and it means one thing: the gods are waking, and you need to be ready before they do. Because here's a fun theological concept that probably won't trouble your modern life. In Temple Hinduism, the deity literally resides in the image. The murti, that carved stone representation, isn't just a symbol. It's not like hanging a cross on your wall. The God is there in that form, breathing, sleeping, waking, needing care. And you, fortunate soul that you are, have been born into a family of temple servants. Your dharma, your cosmic duty and role in this life, is to serve. The time is somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m. The exact time varies by temple, by region, by the specific requirements of the presiding deity. Some temples wake their gods earlier, some slightly later, but none, and I want to stress this, none of them acknowledge that 3 a.m. is an absolutely unholy hour to be conscious and functional. But Dharma doesn't care about your sleep cycle. You rise from your mat on the floor, no bed, certainly nothing resembling a mattress with memory foam, and whatever those pillows are filled with that cost more than a peasant's yearly income. Just a woven mat, perhaps a thin cloth for covering. You slept in the clothes you'll work in, or something very similar, because the concept of pajamas as a separate category of clothing is a luxury beyond imagination. Everything you own you could carry in a single bundle if you needed to flee, and given the periodic invasions, wars, and upheavals of medieval India, this isn't entirely unreasonable. But you're not fleeing, you're serving. And service begins with your own purification because, and this is where things get theologically intricate, you cannot approach the divine while you are impure. And you, simply by virtue of having slept, having existed in your body for 8 hours, are profoundly, dramatically impure. You stumble out into the pre-dawn darkness. Other figures are moving, similarly groggy, similarly obligated. You're heading to water, specifically to a temple tank, a large rectangular pool, or, if the temple is fortunate enough to be near a river, to the river itself. The water is cold, not refreshingly cool, cold. The kind of cold that makes every nerve in your body scream in protest. Because you're in India, yes. But India gets genuinely cold in the early morning hours before dawn, especially in winter months. The air temperature might be pleasant during the day, but at 3:30 a.m., standing at the edge of a stone tank filled with water that hasn't been warmed by any sun, you're going to feel it. You wade in. Not a quick splash, not a cursory rinse, a full immersion. Your head goes under. Once, twice, 3 times. Some traditions require more. The water fills your ears, your nose if you're not careful, and washes over your body with a thoroughness that feels less like cleansing and more like punishment. You emerge, gasping slightly despite your years of practice. Water streaming from your hair, your clothes, if you wore them in, clinging to your body. But you're not done, because external purity is only the beginning. You must rinse your mouth a specific number of times. You must perform achamana, sipping water from your right palm in a prescribed manner, swallowing, repeating. The water purifies the inside of your body just as the immersion purified the outside. Every gesture has meaning. Every action is ritual. There is no such thing as just washing up. You are not getting ready for work. You are preparing yourself to stand in the presence of the divine, and the divine has standards. If you are male and of a certain age, you'll perform the sacred thread ceremony's daily obligations. If you are female, you have different but equally exacting requirements. The idea that religion might be a private, personal affair? Absolutely laughable. Your body, your actions, your very existence is public, communal, and under constant surveillance, not from any human authority necessarily, though that too, but from the cosmic order itself. Dharma sees everything. The gods notice. Dripping, shivering slightly, you return to the temple complex. Other servants are converging, a small army of the devoted and the obligated. Because here's something to understand. Not everyone serving in a temple is there because of burning spiritual devotion. Some are, certainly, but many are there because they were born into families that serve this temple, in this capacity, for generations stretching back into the mists of time. Your grandfather served. Your father serves. You serve. Your sons will serve. This is your jati, your birth group, your inherited occupation and role in the social order. You could no more choose to become a merchant or a warrior than you could choose to be born as a different person entirely. The temple itself is beginning to stir. Oil lamps are being lit, their flames small and yellow in the darkness, casting long shadows across stone corridors and carved pillars. The architecture is extraordinary, soaring gopurams, towering entrance gates covered in thousands of carved figures, pillared halls that seem to stretch forever. The inner sanctum where the deity resides, small and dark and intimate. A womb of stone at the heart of this vast complex. But you barely notice the beauty. You've seen it every day of your life. It's as familiar as your own hands. Your task this morning, and this is if you're fortunate enough to be assigned a relatively clean duty, is to help prepare the deity for waking. This is called the Suprabhata Seva, the Good Morning Service, though I use the term good morning with some irony given the hour. The deity has been sleeping. The doors to the inner sanctum were closed last night after the final ritual, and the god was put to rest like a child, with prayers and lullabies. Now, those doors must be opened, but carefully, ritually, with the proper mantras. You're not important enough to open the doors yourself. That's for the priests, the Brahmins, who are even now approaching with their sacred threads looped over their left shoulders, their hands clean, their minds focused. You watch as they chant, as they perform the precise gestures that have been performed in exactly this way for centuries. The doors open, the first glimpse of the deity, decorated from the night before, garlanded, serene. Your job is to bring water, sanctified water, not the water from the tank where you bathed, but water that has been purified through ritual, stored in specific vessels, and which must be carried in a specific manner. You fill brass vessels, careful not to spill a drop, and carry them into the sanctum's outer area. You cannot enter the inner sanctum itself. You're not pure enough, not high enough in the hierarchy. That space is for priests only. The deity must be bathed. Abhisheka, the ritual bathing, is an elaborate affair. Water is poured over the murti, not carelessly, but with prayers, with mantras, with each pour carrying meaning. Milk follows, and honey, and yogurt, and ghee, clarified butter. The deity is literally bathed in nourishment, in offerings, the liquids flowing over carved stone, dripping down, pooling at the base. You'll clean up that mixture later, carefully collecting it, because it's now prasadam, blessed by contact with the divine. Nothing can be wasted. More servants bring more offerings. Fresh flowers, enormous quantities of them because the gods appreciate beauty and freshness. Jasmine, marigolds, roses, lotus flowers when available. The scent in the early morning air is overwhelming, sweet, cloying, mixing with the smell of incense that's now being lit, thick gray smoke curling upward. Someone is bringing fruit, perfect specimens, arranged on bronze plates. Someone else is bringing betel leaves and areca nuts, the deity's after-meal digestive, because yes, the gods eat, and yes, they need their digestion considered. You're sweeping, or you're polishing brass lamps, or you're ensuring the courtyard is clean of any fallen leaves, any bird droppings, any imperfection that might offend the divine eye. The work is constant and incredibly specific. There's a right way to sweep, a right way to hold the lamp, a right direction to move in as you clean, clockwise, always clockwise, following the path of the sun, auspicious and proper. Move counterclockwise, and you're inviting chaos, inauspiciousness, the attention of malevolent forces. The priests are dressing the deity now. Yes, dressing. The murtai receives clothes, fresh silks, jewelry, decorations that change with the season, the festival, the day of the week. The deity has a wardrobe that would make royalty envious, and all of it must be maintained, cleaned, stored properly, brought out at the right times. You might be responsible for storing those textiles, for ensuring they're protected from insects, from moisture, from any degradation. You handle them with care, because these aren't just clothes. These are garments that have touched the divine form. By now, dawn is breaking. The sky is lightening from black to deep blue to pale gray. The first rays of sun touch the Gopuram's peak, and there's a moment, you feel it even after years of this routine, when the temple seems to come alive. Light spills into courtyards. Birds begin their morning songs. The air, cold earlier, starts to warm slightly. The deity is awake, bathed, dressed, fed. The first ritual of the day is complete, but your day is nowhere near complete. The deity will require 5 to 6 major ritual services throughout the day, depending on the temple's tradition. Each one requires preparation, execution, and cleanup. Between these major services are smaller observances, offerings brought by devotees, lamps to be lit and maintained, incense to be refreshed. The temple is not a building that just sits there. It's a living, breathing entity, requiring constant care, constant attention, constant labor. You might eat now, finally, but even eating is hedged with restrictions. You cannot eat just anything, and certainly not anywhere. Food must be pure, prepared properly, by the right people, eaten in the right manner. If your family is vegetarian, and as temple servants associated with a major deity, you almost certainly are, you've never tasted meat in your life. You've never eaten fish. You've never even eaten certain vegetables considered too heating, too impure, too associated with lower castes. Onions and garlic are forbidden in many temple traditions, considered too stimulating, too worldly. Your breakfast, if we can call it that, might be some leftover rice from last night, mixed with buttermilk if you're fortunate, a pinch of salt, or perhaps some simple gruel, a watery rice porridge. There's no variety, no excitement, just sustenance. You eat sitting on the floor, using your right hand. The left hand is impure, used for cleaning oneself and never to touch food. You eat in silence or in quiet conversation with other servants, and when you're done, you clean your hands and mouth again. More ritual washing. Always more washing. The midday service is approaching. The deity must be offered the main meal, an elaborate spread of dishes prepared in the temple kitchen by cooks who are themselves undergoing constant purification. You've never been allowed in that kitchen. Wrong caste, wrong purity status. But you've seen the results. Rice, vegetables, lentils, special sweets, all prepared without onions or garlic, all seasoned perfectly, all offered in specific sequences with specific mantras. You're carrying brass plates again, or fanning the deity, or maintaining the lamps that must never go out. Your back is beginning to ache. That's normal. You're standing for hours, walking on stone floors, bending, kneeling, rising, bending again. There are no breaks, no sitting down on the job, no casual moments. This is service to the divine. You endure. Afternoon brings a brief respite. The deity rests, and so, to some extent, can you. You might sit in the shade of a pillar, your back against cool stone, just breathing. Other servants are doing the same, a scattered handful of exhausted figures in a vast complex. Somewhere, a priest is still chanting, because the chanting never truly stops. Mantras are being muttered continuously, the sound of Sanskrit syllables echoing through corridors, a constant reminder that this is a space saturated with the sacred. You're thirsty, always thirsty. The work is physical. The heat is building as the sun climbs, and you've been awake for 9 or 10 hours already. You drink water from a clay pot, cool from evaporation, but not too much, because you'll need to urinate, and that requires leaving the temple complex, walking to the designated area, then purifying yourself again before you can return. Every biological necessity is an inconvenience, a source of impurity that must be ritually corrected. The evening service is approaching. This is the most elaborate of the day, when devotees crowd into the temple, when the oil lamps are multiplied into hundreds, when the air becomes thick with incense and flower scent and human bodies. You're helping manage the crowds, ensuring people move in the proper direction. Don't get too close to the sanctum. Don't disturb the ritual proceedings. People are bringing offerings, coconuts, flowers, small amounts of money. You're collecting these or directing people to the proper collection points. Some devotees are weeping in religious ecstasy. Some are simply standing, hands folded, lips moving in prayer. Some are prostrating, full length on the stone floor, rising, prostrating again. The sound is a low murmur, hundreds of people muttering prayers in a dozen different languages and dialects, all mixing together into a sound like distant thunder, constant and rolling. The priests are performing arati now, the waving of lamps before the deity. Multiple wicks, brass lamps, being moved in precise circles, the light dancing across the murti's face, making the painted eyes seem almost alive. You're watching from the back, too far away to see clearly, but you've seen this thousands of times. You know every movement, every gesture, every moment when the priest will raise the lamp high, bring it low, circle 3 times, 5 times, 7 times. The crowd surges forward when the arati is complete, everyone wanting to receive the blessed flame, to wave their hands through its heat, and then touch, their hands to their foreheads, absorbing the blessing. You're trying to maintain order, but it's like trying to organize water. People flow around you, past you, pressing forward with a desperation that would be comic if you weren't so tired. The prasadam is being distributed now, that mixture of offerings that touched the deity, mixed together into a sweet, sticky substance. Everyone wants some. Everyone believes it carries the God's grace, the God's blessing. You'll get some, too, later, after the crowds have thinned. Not because you're first in line, you're never first in line, but because servants do receive portions. It's one of the benefits of the position such as it is. Night is falling. The deity must be put to rest. You're helping close down the temple, ensuring all the lamps are properly situated for the night, that the doors are secured, that everything is in order. The final prayers are being chanted, a lullaby for a god, and then, at last, the inner sanctum doors close. But you're still not done. The temple complex must be cleaned. All the flower offerings from the day, now wilted and browning, must be collected and disposed of properly, not thrown away carelessly, but taken to a specific location, perhaps the temple tank, where they can dissolve back into nature. The floors must be swept again. The brass vessels must be cleaned. Every lamp must be checked, every door secured. It's approaching midnight. You've been awake for 20 hours, perhaps more. Your feet ache. Your back is a constant throb of pain. Your hands are rough from work, cracked in places despite the constant water contact, or perhaps because of it. You eat something simple, sitting on your mat in your small room in the servants' quarters. Then you lie down, pull the thin cloth over yourself, and close your eyes. 4 hours until the bell rings again. 4 hours of sleep, and then you'll rise and do this again, and again, and again, for the rest of your life. This is your dharma. This is your fate. This is the cosmic order working itself out through your body, your labor, your endless, faithful service. And the truly ironic part, you're one of the fortunate ones. You're connected to a temple, to the divine, to something larger than yourself. You have a role in the cosmic order. Lower castes, untouchables, wouldn't even be allowed to enter this temple. They'd be beaten, or worse, for polluting the sacred space with their presence. So, in the grand hierarchy of suffering, you're actually doing quite well. Sleep now, if you can. The gods certainly are. Now, you might think, and I wouldn't blame you for this comforting thought as you drift toward sleep, that being a king in ancient or medieval India would exempt you from the religious obligations we've just explored. After all, you're the monarch. You have power, wealth, armies at your command. Surely the gods would cut you some slack. Recognize that you have kingdoms to run, wars to fight, political intrigues to navigate. You would be spectacularly wrong. In fact, being a king made your religious obligations exponentially more complex, more demanding, and infinitely more consequential. Because here's the theological predicament. A king wasn't just a political leader. A king was a cosmic necessity, a linchpin in the proper functioning of the universe itself. The Sanskrit term is Chakravartin for the ideal universal monarch, literally one whose chariot wheels roll everywhere. But even ordinary kings carried an extraordinary burden. They were protectors of Dharma, the cosmic order. If the king failed in his religious duties, it wasn't just his soul at risk. It was the entire kingdom, every subject, every harvest, every birth and death under his rule. No pressure. Let us imagine yourself, again, lightly, without too much engagement, as a king in medieval South India, perhaps the 11th or 12th century. You're a Chola king, or perhaps a Pandya or Chalukya ruler. Your kingdom is prosperous, or at least it was last monsoon season. Your capital is a thriving city, with markets and temples and workshops, producing the finest bronzes and textiles. You have several wives, multiple sons, some legitimate, some less so, and a court full of advisors, generals, ministers, and priests who all want your attention, your favor, your ear for just one moment regarding this urgent matter. You wake before dawn. Not quite as early as the temple servants. You're allowed perhaps an extra hour, but still, dawn is approaching, and you must be awake to witness it. Because a king witnessing the dawn is itself a ritual act, a renewal of the contract between sovereign and son, between earthly power and cosmic order. You rise from your bed, an actual bed, raised off the ground with fine textiles and cushions that the temple servant would consider impossibly luxurious, but even this comfort is circumscribed by ritual. Before you can do anything else, before you can speak to your queens, before you can address any matters of state, you must purify yourself. Yes, even kings must bathe. Even kings must perform the morning ablutions. Your bath, however, is rather different from the temple servants' cold plunge. Servants bring heated water, perfumed with sandalwood and other auspicious substances. You have a bathing chamber, privacy, attendants who pour the water over you in a manner that's both cleansing and reverential. But the underlying theology is identical. You are impure from sleep, and you cannot perform your duties, religious or political, while impure. You bathe, you rinse your mouth, you perform achamana. If you're initiated into specific Vedic traditions, you'll perform more elaborate morning rituals, perhaps the Sandhya Vandanam, the twilight prayer that must be recited at dawn, noon, and dusk. You'll sit facing east, hands in prescribed mudras, chanting Sanskrit verses that your guru taught you years ago, verses you may or may not fully understand but which you've memorized perfectly, because accuracy matters more than comprehension. Your priest, your personal priest, a learned Brahmin who serves your household, is present, guiding you through more complex rituals, because unlike the temple servant, you're not just serving the gods. You're performing rituals on behalf of your entire kingdom. The morning puja you conduct in your private shrine isn't personal devotion. It's statecraft. You're invoking blessings for the realm, for the harvest, for victory in war if war is coming, for the health of your subjects. The shrine in your palace is elaborate, multiple deities, because a king can't afford to neglect any god who might take offense. The family deity, the Kuladevam, has pride of place. Perhaps Shiva in his form as Nataraja, the cosmic dancer, cast in bronze by the finest artisans in your kingdom. But there's also Vishnu, because excluding Vishnu would be politically and theologically disastrous. There's Ganesha, remover of obstacles, absolutely essential for any undertaking. There's the goddess, perhaps Durga or Kali or Lakshmi, depending on your family tradition and what you need. Protection, wealth, victory. You make offerings, flowers, incense, food, water, milk, honey. Your priest is chanting, and you're repeating certain mantras, your hands moving through gestures your body knows by memory. The ritual takes perhaps an hour, maybe more, on festival days or days when specific planetary alignments require propitiation. Your mind might wander. There's a rebellion brewing in the northern provinces. Your eldest son is showing alarming ambition. The monsoon was weak last year, and the treasury is strained, but you force yourself back to focus. The gods notice inattention. The gods take offense at half-hearted devotion. Finally, the morning puja is complete. You can eat, but even this is ritualized. You eat seated on the floor. Everyone eats seated on the floor, regardless of rank, because chairs and tables for dining are not part of the cultural practice. The food is vegetarian, elaborately prepared by Brahmin cooks in a kitchen that's maintained as a sacred space. Multiple dishes, yes, because you're a king and can afford variety, but all strictly vegetarian. No meat, no fish, no eggs. The ancient texts are clear that truly elevated souls, truly pure beings, subsist on sattvic food, pure, light, vegetarian. There's a philosophical irony here that's not lost on you, even if you don't dwell on it. As a kshatriya, a member of the warrior caste, your dharma includes violence. You're required to fight, to kill enemies, to lead armies into battle. But you're also required to maintain ritual purity, to live like a Brahmin in many ways, to abstain from meat-eating even as you preside over deaths on the battlefield. The contradiction is baked into the cosmic order. You accept it, as you accept monsoons and drought, birth and death. After breakfast, you can finally attend to governance. Your court assembles ministers, generals, priests, merchants seeking licenses, villagers bringing disputes. You sit on your throne, elevated above the rest, and you listen. Disputes over water rights between two villages, a merchant claiming another merchant cheated him, a request to build a new temple, a report from your general about movements of a rival king's army. But here's where religion and governance become indistinguishable. Every decision you make is also a dharmic decision. You're not just settling disputes. You're upholding dharma, cosmic order, the proper functioning of society. If you rule unjustly, if you favor the rich over the poor, if you allow the strong to oppress the weak, you're not just being a bad king. You're violating cosmic law. The texts are explicit. An unjust king brings drought, famine, disease, and disorder to his realm. The king's morality and the land's fertility are mystically connected. So you listen carefully. You consult your chief minister, your priest, your legal advisors, who've memorized vast portions of the Dharma Shastras, the law books that govern everything from property rights to marriage rules to punishment for crimes. The punishment for theft depends on what was stolen, who stole it, who it was stolen from, the time of day, the phase of the moon. I exaggerate, but only slightly. The law is extraordinarily complex, because Dharma is complex, because cosmic order doesn't do simplicity. A case. A Brahmin and a Shudra are both claiming ownership of a piece of land. The Brahmin says his family has worked it for 3 generations. The Shudra says his family has worked it for 5 generations, but he has no written documents. He's illiterate, as most Shudras are. You know, because the texts tell you that you must favor the Brahmin. Not because the Brahmin is necessarily telling the truth, but because Brahmins occupy a higher position in the cosmic order. Their word carries more weight. To rule against a Brahmin in favor of a Shudra would be to invert the hierarchy, to introduce chaos. You rule for the Brahmin. The Shudra leaves clearly bitter, clearly believing, probably correctly, that justice wasn't served, but Dharma was served. The cosmic order was maintained. That's what matters. You feel a twinge of something, guilt perhaps, or just discomfort, but you suppress it. Personal feelings are irrelevant. You're not a person making a personal decision. You're a king maintaining cosmic order. Midday approaches. You must perform the noon Sandhya Vandanam, the midday prayers. Your priest reminds you, though you hardly need reminding. This is so ingrained in your routine that forgetting it would feel like forgetting to breathe. You retreat to your shrine again, face north this time, and chant. The sun is at its zenith, blazing overhead, and you're acknowledging it, honoring it, maintaining the relationship between earthly power and celestial forces. The afternoon brings more governance. A delegation from a neighboring kingdom. You must receive them with elaborate courtesy, with gifts, with ritual exchanges that are themselves a form of diplomacy. The wrong gift can be an insult. The right gift can cement an alliance. Your ministers have spent days preparing for this meeting, consulting texts on proper protocol, on what gifts are auspicious for which occasions. The visiting ambassador brings you fine horses from Central Asia, magnificent animals that must have cost a fortune. You reciprocate with gold, with pearls, with specially commissioned bronze sculptures of deities. But before any of this exchange can happen, there are prayers. You and the ambassador both offer prayers in your respective traditions, acknowledging the gods as witnesses to your diplomatic negotiations, because treaties without divine sanction are just words. The gods must approve, must bless, must look favorably on the agreement. You discuss trade, tribute, mutual defense. There's a rival king to the west who's been expansionist lately, and neither of you wants to face him alone. An alliance makes sense politically, but it must also make sense religiously. Your priests and his priests must consult the astrological charts, must determine if the alignment of planets favors this alliance. If Jupiter is in the wrong house, if Saturn is casting an inauspicious aspect, the alliance might bring disaster, regardless of military logic. Astrology isn't superstition in this context. It's science. The movements of celestial bodies influence earthly events. This is understood, accepted, foundational. To ignore astrology would be like ignoring weather patterns when planning a naval voyage. Suicidal. The priests consult. The charts are drawn up. There's some debate. Your priest sees one interpretation, his priest sees another, but eventually they agree. The alliance is auspicious, provided certain conditions are met. You must perform a specific sacrifice on a specific date. He must donate to a temple. Both conditions are easily met. The alliance is sealed. But it's now late afternoon, and you're exhausted. The weight of decision-making, of maintaining the proper protocols, of constantly being aware of your cosmic responsibilities. It's heavier than any armor you've worn in battle. At least, in battle, you know who the enemy is. In governance, every decision has consequences that ripple outward in ways you can't fully predict, affecting people you'll never meet, invoking karmic debts that might not come due for lifetimes. Evening approaches. The sunset Sandhya Vandanam must be performed. You're back at your shrine, facing west now, watching the sun sink toward the horizon through an open window, chanting the ancient verses. Your mind is crowded with the day's issues, the land dispute, the alliance, the worrying news about the harvest in the southern districts, but you push it all aside. This moment is for the gods. This moment is for Dharma. After the prayers, there's the evening meal, more elaborate than breakfast, because you can afford to feed your entire court, and feeding others is itself a meritorious act. Your palace dining hall fills with nobles, ministers, generals, priests, all seated on the floor in strict hierarchical order, with you at the center, slightly elevated. Food is served on fresh banana leaves, no plates, because plates must be washed, but banana leaves can be disposed of after use, and their use is auspicious. The meal is lavish by any standard. Multiple rice dishes, lentils, vegetables, chutneys, pickles, yogurt, sweets made from jaggery and coconut and milk. Servants move through the hall with brass vessels, serving, reserving, ensuring no leaf is empty unless its owner is finished. You eat mechanically, tasting nothing, because your mind is elsewhere. One of your sons is at this dinner, the ambitious one, and he's talking with a general, their conversation too quiet for you to hear, their body language suggesting conspiracy. You'll deal with that later, or perhaps you won't. Succession crises are built into the system. You have multiple wives, multiple sons, all legitimate, all with claims. Some of them won't survive to old age. Some will rebel. Some will be executed. This is normal. This is expected. The cosmic order doesn't guarantee familial harmony. Night falls. You can finally retire to your private chambers, to your senior queen's rooms perhaps, or to your own chambers if you're seeking solitude. But even here, even in what should be private moments, you're not free from religious obligation. Sexual activity between husband and wife is regulated by religious law. Certain days of the month are forbidden. The wife's menstrual period, obviously, renders her impure and untouchable. But also, The 11th day of each lunar fortnight is forbidden, being sacred to Vishnu. New moon and full moon days are forbidden. Festival days are forbidden. When you do engage in marital relations, it must be for the purpose of procreation, ideally. The texts are clear that excessive sensual pleasure is spiritually degrading, even within marriage. You should approach your wife with proper mantras, at auspicious times determined by astrology, with the intention of producing virtuous offspring. The idea of sex as recreation, as pleasure for its own sake, is not exactly condemned, but it's certainly not celebrated. It's a concession to human weakness, something to be gradually transcended as one advances spiritually. Tonight, you're alone. Your wife is in her menstrual seclusion, untouchable for 4 days. You lie on your bed, fine cotton sheets, silk pillows, and stare at the ceiling. The palace is quiet, though never silent. Guards patrol. Servants move through corridors on various errands. Somewhere, a priest is chanting evening prayers in one of the palace shrines. The sound carries a low drone of Sanskrit syllables, oddly comforting in its constancy. You think about the temple you're building. It's your primary religious project, the act that will define your reign and ensure your name is remembered. You're constructing a massive temple complex dedicated to Shiva. Soaring gopurams, intricate carvings, a bronze Nataraja that will be the finest ever cast. The expense is staggering. The labor force numbers in the thousands. Villages have been assigned to provide food for the workers. Artisans have been imported from across South India and beyond. This temple isn't vanity, though there's certainly an element of ego involved. This temple is dharma. You're providing employment. You're creating beauty. You're giving the gods a worthy dwelling place. You're ensuring that rituals can be performed properly for generations. The merit you're accumulating through this project is incalculable. It might offset the negative karma from the wars you've fought, the enemies you've killed, the harsh judgments you've passed. Might. Karma is complicated. The cosmic accountants don't share their ledgers. You're also planning a major sacrifice, a yajna, a fire ritual of a type not performed in several generations. It requires dozens of Brahmin priests, all of whom must be supported and fed and gifted with cows and gold. It requires precise construction of fire altars. It requires months of preparation. The expense will strain your treasury, but again, this is dharma. This is the king's duty. The sacrifice will purify the realm, will invoke divine blessings, will demonstrate to your subjects and to rival kings that you're a Chakravartin, a true sovereign, worthy of the title. The irony, of course, is that despite all this devotion, all these rituals, all these sacrifices and temples and gifts to Brahmins, you have no guarantee of a positive outcome. You might be reborn as a god, yes, in one of the many heavens that Hindu cosmology describes in loving detail. You might be reborn as a Brahmin in your next life, enjoying spiritual privilege without the burden of kingship. But you might also be reborn as something considerably less pleasant, a dog, an insect, a demon in one of the many hells, because karma is influenced by so many factors. Your intentions matter, but so do your actions. Your public religious devotion matters, but so do your private thoughts. That moment of anger when you executed a rebellious noble, was it just punishment or was it excessive cruelty? That moment of desire when you looked at a courtier's wife, did you indulge the thought, or did you suppress it immediately? Every mental state, every emotion, every fleeting impulse leaves a karmic trace. You fall asleep, finally, knowing you'll wake in a few hours to begin this cycle again. Tomorrow, there's a festival, a minor one, but it still requires your participation. You'll process to the main city temple, riding an elephant surrounded by your court, observed by thousands of subjects who see you not as a man, but as a living embodiment of divine authority. You'll offer prayers. You'll make donations. You'll bless the crowds by your presence. And the day after that, there's a judicial case involving a Brahmin accused of theft, a nearly impossible situation, because Brahmins can't be punished with the same severity as other castes. You'll have to find some creative solution that upholds Dharma while not completely offending everyone's sense of justice. And the day after that, and the day after that, endless cycles of obligation, of ritual, of trying to balance political necessity with cosmic law. The truly maddening part. You wouldn't trade this for anything. Despite the exhaustion, despite the impossible contradictions, despite the crushing weight of responsibility, you're a king. You're at the apex of human achievement in this life. The alternatives, being a merchant, a farmer, a temple servant, gods forbid and untouchable, are all incomparably worse. You have power, wealth, luxury, and the opportunity to perform Dharma on a scale unavailable to ordinary people. You're trapped, but you're trapped in gold chains. You're obligated, but your obligations come with privileges that 99% of humanity can only dream about. You'll perform your duties, you'll build your temple, you'll fight your wars, you'll judge your cases, and perhaps, if you're extraordinarily fortunate and have accumulated sufficient merit, you'll be reborn into circumstances even more favorable than these, or you'll transcend rebirth entirely, achieving moksha, liberation from the cycle of samsara. Though honestly, given your attachment to power, to sensual pleasures, to the very idea of kingship, moksha seems distant enough that you don't worry about it much. There will be many more lifetimes, many more chances, many more opportunities to work toward that ultimate goal. For now, you're a king. You serve the gods and rule the people and maintain cosmic order. You wake before dawn and perform rituals and make judgments and build temples. This is your dharma. This is your fate. This is the role you've been given in this particular cosmic drama. And somewhere in a temple in your capital, a servant is waking to a bronze bell, beginning another day of back-breaking labor in service to the same gods you serve, maintaining the same cosmic order you maintain, but from a position so much lower, so much more exhausting, so much more thankless, that your own burdens seem almost trivial by comparison. Almost. Sleep now, dreaming perhaps of past glories or future temples, of victorious battles or auspicious marriages, of the endless, intricate, exhausting dance of maintaining Dharma in a world that constantly threatens to slide into chaos. The gods are watching. They're always watching. And they have such specific, demanding, impossible to fully satisfy expectations. Now we drift, as you should be drifting toward sleep, into a different kind of mystery. Not the mystery of what daily life felt like. Not the mystery of how individuals navigated impossible, religious obligations, but the mystery of knowledge itself. How it was preserved, how it was transmitted, how it was lost, and how entire libraries of meaning could vanish, while the words themselves remained perfectly intact, like beautiful shells on a beach, empty of the creatures that once inhabited them. Imagine, and again, I encourage only the gentlest imagining, nothing that would stimulate alertness, a young Brahmin boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, in a village in ancient North India. The date is uncertain. Perhaps 800 BCE, perhaps 600 BCE. Time moves differently when civilizations don't obsess over precise chronology, when history is cyclical rather than linear, when the past is understood through mythology as much as through fact. This boy has been chosen, or rather, his birth has determined his fate. He's a Brahmin, born into a family of priests who have preserved certain hymns, certain verses, certain sacred knowledge for as far back as family memory extends. His father knows these verses. His grandfather knew them. His great-great-great-grandfather, though no one remembers his name, knew them. And now it's this boy's turn to learn them. But here's what makes this different from anything in your experience. He will not learn them by reading. There are no books. There are no written texts. There is only sound, only the human voice, only the extraordinary capacity of human memory when pushed to its absolute limits and beyond. The Vedas, the foundational sacred texts of Hinduism, enormous collections of hymns, ritual instructions, philosophical speculation, and cosmic meditation, were not written down, not for centuries, not for perhaps 1,000 years or more after they were composed. They existed solely in the minds and mouths of Brahmin priests who devoted their entire lives to memorization, to perfect preservation, to ensuring that not a single syllable, not a single vocal inflection, not a single pause was altered from one generation to the next. Why? Because the words themselves were sacred. Not the meaning, primarily, though meaning mattered, but the actual sound, the phonemes, the rhythm, the pitch, the duration of each syllable. Sanskrit was understood as a divine language, and the Vedic hymns were understood as eternal, uncreated, heard by ancient sages in states of deep meditation. To change even one sound would be to corrupt the divine. To forget even one syllable would be to lose something irreplaceable, something cosmically significant. So this boy begins his training. Every morning, after the ritual bath, after the morning prayers, he sits before his guru, his teacher, often his own father or uncle, and he listens. The guru chants a line, perhaps just 5 or 6 words. The boy repeats it, not approximately, not close enough, exactly. The same pitch, the same rhythm, the same duration, again, and again, and again, 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, until the line is so deeply embedded in his neural pathways that he could recite it while half asleep, while distracted, while his mind is elsewhere. Then, the next line. The same process. Repetition, endless repetition until perfect mastery. Then the next line, and gradually, over months, these lines connect into verses, verses into hymns, hymns into collections. He's memorizing the Rig Veda, let's say, the oldest of the Vedas, over 1,000 hymns comprising more than 10,000 verses. Or perhaps he's specializing in the Yajur Veda, the ritual formulas needed for sacrifices, or the Samaveda, the musical arrangements of Vedic hymns, or the Atharva Veda, the spells and charms for everything from curing snakebite to cursing enemies to ensuring marital fidelity. The time investment is staggering. This boy will spend perhaps 8 to 12 years in intensive study, living with his guru, serving him, performing household tasks, and spending every available hour in memorization. He will have almost no childhood as we understand it. No play, no leisure, no exploration of interests. Just memorization, service, and the slow, gradual internalization of thousands upon thousands of Sanskrit syllables. And here's the truly extraordinary part. The memorization techniques developed to preserve these texts were so sophisticated, so elaborate, that they make modern memory techniques look like crude sketches compared to Renaissance paintings. The texts weren't just memorized forward. They were memorized backward. They were memorized with alternate words swapped. They were memorized in patterns that looked like weaving. First word, third word, second word, fourth word, and so on in increasingly complex configurations. These techniques, called Vikruti Pathas, or modified recitations, served as error-checking mechanisms. If you could recite a hymn forward and backward and in 5 different patterns, you clearly had it exactly right. Any corruption, any error, any accidental substitution would immediately become apparent. The system was so effective that when the Vedas were finally written down, centuries later, the different oral traditions from different regions of India, traditions that had been separated for hundreds of years, matched almost perfectly. A handful of minor variations, but substantially identical. That's what rigorous oral preservation can achieve. But oral preservation, for all its sophistication, has a fundamental limitation. It preserves sound, not necessarily meaning. And this is where our mystery deepens, where we encounter one of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of ancient Hindu texts. By the time Sanskrit scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars primarily, along with Indian scholars trained in modern philological methods, began seriously studying the Vedas, much of the meaning had been lost. The words were perfectly preserved. The grammar could be analyzed. The phonetics were pristine. But what did it mean when a Rigvedic hymn invoked Indra with a particular epithet? What was the actual referent of certain terms? What were these hymns actually talking about? The traditional Brahmin interpretation, preserved in commentaries written centuries after the Vedas themselves, often seemed forced, artificial, reading meanings backward into texts that might have meant something quite different to their original composers. The commentators were brilliant scholars, absolutely, but they were separated from the Vedic period by perhaps 1,000 years or more. Imagine trying to interpret Anglo-Saxon poetry from 700 CE using only medieval commentaries from 1700 CE, and you begin to grasp the problem. Consider a famous example. The Rigveda contains many hymns to Indra, the great warrior god, the storm god, the dragon slayer. He defeats Vritra, a serpent or dragon who had imprisoned the waters. He releases the waters, bringing rain and life. This much is clear. But what are the waters? Are they literal rivers? Are they clouds? Are they some cosmic principle? Are they consciousness itself? The commentaries give different answers. Modern scholars give different answers. And we, sitting here centuries later with our perfectly preserved Sanskrit text, cannot know for certain what the original composers meant. Or consider the Soma sacrifice, one of the central rituals of Vedic religion. Soma was a plant, that much is clear. It was pressed, its juice extracted, filtered through wool, mixed with milk or water, and offered to the gods while priests chanted hymns praising its effects. The gods loved Soma. Indra drank Soma before battling demons. Soma was described in ecstatic terms as bestowing immortality, vision, power, and divine connection. But what plant was Soma? We don't know. The identity of the Soma plant was lost, probably by around 500 BCE or so, perhaps earlier. By the time of the later texts, the Brahmanas and Upanishads substitutes were being used. Various plants were suggested: ephedra, cannabis, psilocybin mushrooms, Syrian rue. Dozens of candidates have been proposed by modern scholars. But the original identity? Gone? Forgotten? Lost despite the meticulous preservation of every single syllable of every hymn praising it. This is the fundamental irony of oral preservation. It can preserve exact sounds across millennia, but it cannot preserve context, cannot preserve the cultural knowledge, that made those sounds meaningful. When you live in the culture, you don't need to explain. When you invoke Indra, everyone knows who Indra is, what his myths are, what he represents. When you mention Soma, everyone has drunk it or seen it drunk, knows what it looks like, how it's prepared. The hymns don't need to explain these things any more than a modern song needs to explain what a car is. But let that culture shift, let those practices cease, let several centuries pass, and suddenly those references become opaque. The words remain, pristine and perfect, but their meanings blur, multiply, become subjects of endless, scholarly debate. Let us drift forward in time, to perhaps 400 or 300 BCE. The Vedas are still being preserved orally, still being transmitted with perfect accuracy. But new texts are being composed, texts that are trying to interpret the Vedas, to explain them, to extract philosophical meaning from ritual instructions. These are the Upanishads, philosophical dialogues and meditations that mark a shift in Hindu thought. Where the Vedas focused on ritual, on sacrifice, on maintaining cosmic order through precise performance, the Upanishads focus on knowledge, on meditation, on understanding the nature of reality itself. They ask questions that the Vedas don't ask, or at least don't ask explicitly. What is the self? What is ultimate reality? How does one achieve liberation from the cycle of rebirth? A young student, again a Brahmin, approaches a guru. But this isn't rote memorization now. This is philosophical instruction. The student asks, "What is Brahman?" Brahman being the ultimate reality, the ground of all existence, the cosmic principle that underlies and pervades everything. The guru responds, famously with neti neti, not this, not that. Brahman cannot be described positively, only negatively. It's not the body, it's not the mind, it's not the breath, it's not consciousness as we normally understand consciousness. It's beyond, transcendent, ineffable. And yet, somehow, it's also Atman, the self, your deepest essence, the great Upanishadic insight, Tattvam Asi, thou art that. You are Brahman. Your truest self is identical with ultimate reality. This is beautiful, profound, philosophically sophisticated. But it's also maddeningly vague. What does it actually mean in practice? How does one realize this identity? The Upanishads give various answers, various meditation techniques, various paths. But there's no single, clear, step-by-step instruction manual. The knowledge is deliberately esoteric, deliberately veiled, meant to be transmitted from guru to student in personal instruction, not broadcast widely. And here's another layer of lost meaning. The Upanishads were secret teachings, meant only for qualified students. The Sanskrit word Upanishad literally means something like sitting down near, implying a student sitting near a teacher to receive confidential instruction. Not everyone was supposed to know these teachings. Not everyone was considered ready for them. Brahmins, yes. Kshatriyas, perhaps. But lower castes? Women? Absolutely not. The knowledge was restricted, guarded, kept within narrow bounds. So when we read the Upanishads today, we're reading texts that were never meant for us. Texts whose full meaning was embedded in an oral teaching relationship. Texts that probably made much more sense when accompanied by a living teacher's explanations, clarifications, and practical instructions. The written texts we have are like receiving someone's lecture notes without having attended the lectures. The outline is there, the key points are there, but the elaborations, the examples, the tone of voice, the emphasis, all lost. Move forward again to perhaps 200 BCE to 200 CE. Now Sanskrit texts are being written down. Not the Vedas necessarily, those remain oral for longer, but newer compositions, the great epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, the Puranas, mythological texts describing the gods, the creation of the universe, the genealogies of kings and sages, the Dharma Shastras, law codes governing every aspect of life. These texts are massive. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem ever composed, over 100,000 verses, about 10 times the length of the Iliad and Odyssey combined. It contains everything: philosophy, mythology, political theory, ethics, war narratives, love stories, and embedded within it, the Bhagavad Gita, perhaps the single most influential Hindu philosophical text. But even though these texts were written down, even though we have manuscripts, the problems of interpretation remain, because these texts weren't composed by single authors sitting down with pens and paper. They were accretions, layers upon layers of material added over centuries. Different sections contradict each other. Different philosophical schools inserted their favored teachings. Later editors added, revised, elaborated. The Bhagavad Gita, for instance, preaches different and sometimes contradictory paths to liberation. Karma Yoga, the path of action. Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Are these meant to be alternatives? Stages in a progression? Different paths for different temperaments? The text doesn't say explicitly. Commentators have argued about this for over a millennium. And then there are the Tantric texts, emerging perhaps around 500 and 600 CE, and continuing into the medieval period. These are the most deliberately esoteric of all, filled with coded language, twilight speech, that says one thing but means another, sexual imagery that might be literal or might be metaphorical for spiritual processes, practices involving substances and rituals that Orthodox Brahmanism explicitly forbids, meat, alcohol, sexual congress, cremation ground rituals. A tantric text might instruct the practitioner to meditate on the union of Shiva and Shakti, the masculine and feminine cosmic principles. But what does this mean in practice? Is it visualization? Is it ritual sex with a consecrated partner? Is it meditation on energy centers in the body? Is it all of these, none of these, something else entirely? The texts are deliberately obscure because these teachings were secret, meant only for initiated disciples who received oral instruction from qualified gurus. Without the guru's explanation, the texts are nearly impenetrable. And since these teaching lineages often died out, since gurus and disciples both eventually died and the oral instructions weren't always passed on, we're left with texts whose meanings are partial, contested, sometimes completely lost. There's a tragic irony here. Hindu civilization developed perhaps the most sophisticated oral preservation techniques in human history. They preserved texts with breathtaking accuracy across millennia, but they couldn't preserve the living context, the cultural knowledge, the oral elaborations that made those texts fully meaningful. The container survived, much of the content evaporated. Modern scholars work with what they have. They compare manuscripts, looking for variant readings. They study commentaries, understanding that these represent interpretations, not certainties. They try to reconstruct historical context using archaeology, linguistics, anthropology. They make educated guesses, propose theories, engage in scholarly debates that have continued for decades or centuries without resolution. And practitioners, modern Hindus who engage with these texts devotionally rather than academically, often rely on tradition, on what their particular sect, their particular guru, their particular community says these texts mean, which is valid, certainly. Meaning is created as much as discovered. If the Bhagavad Gita speaks to you in a particular way, if it provides guidance and inspiration, does it matter that scholars argue about authorial intent? Perhaps not. But the mystery remains. When you read a Rigvedic hymn in translation, you're reading something composed perhaps 3,500 years ago, in a language you probably don't know, referring to a culture you can only dimly reconstruct, invoking gods whose original meanings are debated, describing rituals whose purposes are contested, using metaphors whose referents are lost. You're reading the words, but how much of the meaning are you actually accessing? It's like finding a book in an unknown script. You might eventually decipher the script, figure out the grammar, translate the words, but without any other texts in that language, without any knowledge of the culture that produced it, how much can you really understand? You'll get something, certainly, but you'll miss nuances, references, jokes, implications that would have been obvious to the original audience. Hindu texts occupy a middle ground. We have abundant material, centuries of commentaries, living traditions that claim continuity with the past. But we also have gaps, losses, uncertainties that no amount of scholarship can fully resolve. The texts are simultaneously present and absent, preserved and lost, clear and opaque. And perhaps there's something appropriate about this, something that fits the Hindu philosophical emphasis on the limitations of language, on the inadequacy of words to capture ultimate reality. The Upanishads repeatedly insist that Brahman cannot be described, only experienced. The Tantric texts use coded language because the highest truths cannot be spoken plainly. Even the Vedas, for all their careful preservation, were considered less important than direct realization, direct experience of the divine. So maybe the lost meanings aren't entirely a tragedy. Maybe they're a reminder that texts, however sacred, however carefully preserved, are ultimately just fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. Maybe the mystery is the point. Or maybe that's just a comforting rationalization for an irreplaceable loss. Either way, the texts remain, perfectly preserved sounds in a partially lost language, describing a partially lost world, invoking partially lost meanings. They're studied, chanted, interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, and occasionally understood. They're dead and alive simultaneously, ancient and ever new, clear and mysterious. A young scholar today might spend years learning Sanskrit, might memorize hymns just as Brahmin boys did millennia ago, might write a doctoral dissertation parsing the grammatical structure of a single Upanishadic passage. And at the end of all that study, they might understand something true about these texts, might access some genuine insight, or they might simply have climbed to the top of a very tall mountain only to discover that the view, while impressive, doesn't quite reveal what they'd hoped to see. The landscape stretches onward into mist and distance, beautiful and obscure, inviting and withholding meaning in equal measure. The mystery remains. The texts remain, and we remain, centuries or millennia later, still trying to hear what those ancient sages heard, still trying to know what they knew, still trying to cross a bridge that time has rendered increasingly uncertain. But perhaps the attempt itself is valuable. Perhaps the act of engaging with these texts, of wrestling with their mysteries, of accepting their partial opacity, teaches something that perfect clarity never could. Humility, maybe. Patience. The recognition that knowledge has limits, that understanding is always incomplete, that some things resist our grasping, even as they invite our contemplation. Sleep now, with ancient syllables echoing in the back of your mind, perfectly preserved sounds whose meanings drift like smoke, like morning mist over a sacred river, there and not there, substantial and insubstantial, carrying whispers of something important that you can almost, but not quite, understand. We return now, in this final segment before sleep fully claims you, to the world of people rather than texts, to the lived reality of religious hierarchy. Because if there's one thing that should be abundantly clear from everything we've explored tonight, it's that Hindu religious life was not, and in many ways still is not, egalitarian. The cosmic order, that Dharma we've discussed so extensively, was understood as inherently hierarchical. Some people were born closer to the divine. Some people were born with greater purity, greater spiritual capacity, greater access to sacred knowledge. And some people were born into circumstances so degraded, so polluted, so spiritually compromised that their very shadow falling on a Brahmin could require elaborate purification rituals. This wasn't considered unfair. This was cosmic law, as natural and inevitable as gravity, as the rising sun, as the turning of the seasons. Let us imagine, for the last time tonight, I promise, two lives, contemporary with each other, perhaps in 14th century South India. One is a Brahmin priest, born into a family that has served a major Shaiva temple for generations. The other is an untouchable, a Dalit in modern terminology, though that term wouldn't have been used then. He might have been called a Chandala, a pariah, or by any number of regional terms that all conveyed the same essential information. He was outside the caste system entirely, below even the Shudra laborers, born into a state of such profound impurity that his very existence was a source of pollution. The Brahmin is born in a house, a proper house with multiple rooms, near the temple complex, in the Agra Haram, the Brahmin quarter of the village. His birth is auspicious. Astrologers cast his horoscope, noting the favorable planetary alignments. His father performs the Jatakarma, the birth ritual, whispering sacred mantras into the infant's ear, welcoming him into the world of the twice-born, those who will undergo the sacred thread ceremony and become full members of the spiritual community. The untouchable is born in a hut on the outskirts of the village, beyond the boundaries of the settlement proper, in an area designated for those whose pollution must be kept spatially separate from the pure castes. His birth is attended by women of his own community, because no midwife from a higher caste would pollute herself by touching his mother during childbirth. There are no astrologers, no rituals, no mantras. There is simply survival. The mother survives or doesn't. The infant survives or doesn't. The gods, if they notice at all, keep their distance. The Brahmin child grows up saturated in privilege, though he wouldn't recognize it as privilege because it's simply the natural order of things. He is fed well, vegetarian food carefully prepared but abundant and nutritious. He is taught to read and write, to memorize Sanskrit verses, to understand his family's ritual duties. By the age of 7 or 8, he undergoes the Upanayana, the sacred thread ceremony that marks his second birth, his spiritual birth. He receives the sacred thread, 3 strands looped over his left shoulder and under his right arm, the outward sign of his status as one of the twice-born. He is taught the Gayatri Mantra, perhaps the most sacred verse in the Hindu tradition, a verse that Shudras are forbidden to hear, let alone recite, a verse whose unauthorized hearing was traditionally punishable by having molten lead poured into one's ears. I say this not to be gratuitously disturbing, but because the texts specify this punishment. The cosmic order took its boundaries seriously. The Brahmin boy learns his family's specialty. Perhaps they're priests who perform the morning abhisheka, the ritual bathing of the deity. Perhaps they specialize in the Vedic sacrifices, the increasingly rare yajna rituals that require elaborate knowledge of mantras and procedures. Perhaps they're temple administrators, managing lands and revenues donated to the temple. Whatever their specific role, it involves authority, respect, and a comfort that, while not luxurious by royal standards, is substantial by the standards of the vast majority of the population. He marries young, perhaps 12 or 13, to a girl of 10 or 11 from another Brahmin family, carefully vetted for compatibility of horoscopes, for proper subcaste matching, for family reputation. The marriage is arranged by the families, negotiated over months, involving considerable expense, dowry, gifts, fast, but it's an expense his family can afford. The wedding itself is an elaborate ritual affair, with proper Vedic mantras, with sacred fire, with all the ceremonies that constitute a religiously valid marriage. His adult life unfolds with considerable predictability. He performs his hereditary duties at the temple. He receives payment for these duties, grants of land, shares of temple revenue, gifts from devotees seeking blessings. He is addressed with respect by everyone of lower castes, which is to say, nearly everyone. When he walks through the village, people move aside, not because they fear him personally, but because they recognize his spiritual status. To touch him accidentally would require his ritual purification and their apology. He eats twice a day, substantial meals. He owns several sets of clothing, dhotis, upper cloths, special garments for ritual occasions. He has leisure time to study, to discuss philosophy with other Brahmins, to pursue the intellectual and spiritual life that is supposedly the special dharma of his caste. He performs daily pujas in his home shrine, maintaining his ritual purity, his connection to the divine. When he grows old, he's supported by his sons, who have learned the family profession, who will continue the hereditary duties. When he dies, he receives a proper cremation with full rites, conducted by his eldest son, ensuring his safe passage to the afterlife and his favorable rebirth. His life has been comfortable, respected, spiritually rich, and cosmically secure. Now, the untouchable. He is born into poverty so profound that the Brahmin child, even in his occasional moments of hardship, couldn't truly imagine it. His family's hut has no furniture, just dirt floors, perhaps a few clay pots, some ragged cloths. Food is uncertain, irregular, nutritionally inadequate. The family eats what they can get, scraps, grains too damaged for higher castes to use, and yes, meat. Because untouchables, being already maximally impure, are permitted, and indeed expected, to eat the meat that higher castes won't touch. Dead cattle, animals that died of disease, carrion, the untouchable. Communities are the ones who remove dead animals from villages, who work with leather, who handle corpses, who perform all the tasks that are necessary for society to function, but which involve such profound pollution that no one with ritual purity to protect would dream of doing them. The untouchable boy doesn't learn to read. There are no schools for him, no teachers willing to instruct someone of his status. The sacred texts are forbidden to him, not just forbidden to recite, but forbidden to hear. If he's caught listening to Vedic recitation, the traditional punishment is having his ears filled with molten lace or lead. If he's caught reading sacred texts, having his tongue cut out. These punishments may not always have been enforced, may have been more theoretical than actual, but their very existence in the law codes tells you something about how seriously the boundaries were maintained. His childhood is labor. From the time he can walk, he's helping his family with their hereditary occupation. Perhaps they're leather workers, processing the hides of dead animals, work that requires them to handle carcasses in various stages of decay, that leaves their hands and clothes perpetually stained and reeking. Perhaps they're street sweepers, cleaning the village paths of human and animal waste. Perhaps they're cremation ground workers, handling corpses, maintaining the burning guts, collecting ashes. Every task is polluting. Every task reinforces their status at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And every task is absolutely necessary for the higher castes to maintain their purity. The Brahmins can remain pure because untouchables handle the impure. The cosmic order requires someone to do this work, and that someone is determined by birth, by karma from past lives, by a cosmic justice that operates on timescales far beyond a single lifetime. The untouchable boy grows to adolescence, then young adulthood. He cannot enter the temple. He would pollute it by his presence. He cannot draw water from the village well that higher castes use. His touch would pollute the water for everyone. In some regions, during certain historical periods, he cannot even walk on the same streets as higher castes during certain hours. His shadow falling on a Brahmin is considered polluting. His proximity is toxic to ritual purity. He marries, if he finds someone, in a ceremony that has no Brahmin priests, no Vedic mantras, no sacred fire. The marriage is simply an agreement between families, perhaps with some folk rituals, some local customs, but nothing that would be recognized as religiously valid by the Orthodox. His wife, like him, was born into this circumstance. Together, they will produce children who will also be untouchable, who will inherit this same status, this same set of restrictions and degradations. His daily life is unrelenting labor and humiliation. When higher caste people address him, they use imperatives, not polite forms. They don't use his name, or, if they do, it's without honorifics. He must respond with elaborate respect, with downcast eyes, with hands folded in deference. If he forgets, if he looks directly at a Brahmin, if he speaks without being spoken to, he can be beaten. Not necessarily, not always, but it's within the realm of acceptable social enforcement. He eats once a day if he's fortunate, twice if it's been a good season and there's work. The food is whatever he can get, coarse grains, rotten vegetables from the market that vendors are throwing away, that dead cow's meat that's been sitting for several days in the heat. Malnutrition is his constant companion. Diseases find him easily, living in filth as his work requires, without access to clean water, without any medical care beyond folk remedies. His body is a battleground where illness often wins. He has no leisure, no education, no prospects for improvement. His dharma, the texts would tell him if he could hear them, is to serve faithfully in his hereditary occupation, to accept his status without complaint, to perform his degrading duties with diligence. If he does this, if he accepts his cosmic position without rebellion, perhaps in his next life he'll be reborn as something higher, perhaps a Shudra, still low but within the caste system, perhaps, after many lifetimes of good behavior, something even higher. But this life is suffering, justified by karma from past lives that he cannot remember, that he has no way to verify, that he simply must accept as theological truth. The Brahmins tell him, when they deign to communicate at all, that he's living out the consequences of his own past actions. The untouchables exist because they must have done something terrible in previous lives to deserve this. It's not the current social system that's unjust. It's karma, cosmic justice, working itself out. The irony, though the untouchable himself has no way to appreciate it, is that he and the Brahmin are locked in a symbiotic relationship. The Brahmin's purity requires the untouchable's impurity. Someone must handle corpses, remove dead animals, work with leather, clean streets. If there were no untouchables, Brahmins would have to do these things themselves, thus destroying their own purity. The system requires both poles, the maximally pure and the maximally impure, to function, and yet the distance between them is vast, unbridgeable within a single lifetime. The Brahmin lives in comfort, respect, spiritual security. The untouchable lives in poverty, degradation, and uncertainty. The Brahmin eats twice daily, good food. The untouchable eats once, poor food. The Brahmin is educated, literate, connected to a vast textual tradition. The untouchable is illiterate, cut off from formal knowledge, maintaining only oral traditions of his own community. The Brahmin will receive proper death rites, ensuring favorable rebirth. The untouchable might be dumped in a pit or buried hastily with minimal ceremony, because who will perform elaborate rites for someone so polluted? This isn't ancient history, though we're speaking of medieval India. This system persisted, in various forms, into the modern era. It persists, in attenuated form, even today in some areas, though it's illegal, though it's condemned, though modern India has tried to dismantle these hierarchies through law and social reform. But for the vast majority of Hindu history, this was simply the way things were, natural, inevitable, cosmically ordained. The Brahmin priest living in comfort near the temple, and the untouchable laborer living in a hut on the village outskirts, both understood themselves to be part of the same cosmic system. Both believed in karma, in rebirth, in the essential justice of the universe. The untouchable didn't typically revolt, didn't typically question, because to question Dharma was to question reality itself. The cosmic order was as fixed as the stars, as inevitable as death. You played the role you were given. You performed your duties. You hoped for better circumstances in your next life. And the Brahmin, for his part, didn't typically feel guilt or question his privilege, because it wasn't privilege in his understanding. It was earned status, brought forward from previous lives of meritorious action. He wasn't lucky to be born a Brahmin. He had earned this birth through countless lifetimes of spiritual progress. And if he fulfilled his dharma properly in this life, studying the texts, performing rituals, maintaining purity, he would be reborn even higher, perhaps as a god in one of the heavens, perhaps eventually achieving moksha, liberation from the cycle entirely. The system was self-reinforcing, self-justifying. High status proved past merit. Low status proved past demerit. Present circumstances determined by past actions. Future circumstances determined by present actions. Karma as cosmic accountant, tracking every deed, every thought, every intention across multiple lifetimes, ensuring that justice was done, even if that justice was utterly invisible within the span of a single human life. There were, it must be said, voices of dissent. Buddhism arose partly as a critique of Brahminical privilege. arguing that spiritual attainment wasn't determined by birth, but by individual effort. Early Buddhist texts contain stories of untouchables who achieved enlightenment, of Brahmins who fell into hell, of the cosmic hierarchy being far more fluid than orthodox Hinduism suggested. The Buddha himself was a Kshatriya, not a Brahmin, and he explicitly rejected the idea that Brahmins were inherently superior. Within Hinduism itself, bhakti movements, devotional movements that emphasized personal relationship with God, often challenged caste hierarchies. Poet saints from low castes composed hymns that are still sung today, hymns that emphasize that God doesn't care about your birth, only about your devotion. A devoted, low-caste person is superior to an indifferent Brahmin, these movements proclaimed. The divine is accessible to all. But these were reform movements, challenges to the dominant system, not the dominant system itself. And even bhakti movements, even Buddhism, couldn't fully escape the gravitational pull of caste thinking. Buddhist monasteries in India often maintained caste distinctions. Bhakti temples might welcome low-caste devotees but still reserve certain priestly functions for Brahmins. The hierarchy was too deeply embedded, too thoroughly integrated into every aspect of social and religious life, to be easily dismantled. So the Brahmin and the untouchable lived their parallel lives, sometimes in the same village, occupying the same physical space, but entirely different social and spiritual universes. The Brahmin might glimpse the untouchable from a distance, might issue instructions through intermediaries, might be vaguely aware that these people existed and performed necessary functions. But he wouldn't truly see him as a person, as someone with hopes and fears and dreams, as someone whose suffering was real and undeserved. The untouchable was simply part of the natural order, like rain or drought, to be accepted and accommodated, but not questioned. And the untouchable might see the Brahmin, might watch him process to the temple in fine clothes, might hear the Sanskrit chanting echoing from the temple, might observe the deference everyone showed him, and he might feel, what? Envy? Resentment? Resignation? Probably all of these at different times, depending on the individual, on the day, on circumstances. But underlying it all, probably a deep, unquestioned acceptance that this was how things were, how they had always been, how they would always be. Because to truly question the system was to question the entire cosmological framework. If karma wasn't just, if rebirth wasn't fair, if dharma wasn't cosmic law, then what was anything? If your suffering wasn't the result of your own past actions, if it was just arbitrary cruelty, meaningless degradation, then the universe was chaotic, unjust, unbearable. Better to believe in karma, in future lives, in eventual justice, even if that justice was delayed for lifetimes. Better to believe that your current degradation served some cosmic purpose, that it was temporary on the scale of infinite lifetimes, that better circumstances awaited if you just endured with proper conduct. The Brahmin, meanwhile, could be generous within the bounds of the system. He might give food to beggars. He might ensure that temple prasadam was distributed to all, including low castes and untouchables. He might even, if he was particularly pious and philosophically inclined, reflect on the ultimate equality of all beings at the level of Atman, the universal self. All beings, at their deepest level, are Brahman, are divine, are identical with ultimate reality. But this philosophical insight didn't translate into social reform. The ultimate equality at the level of Atman existed simultaneously with profound inequality at the level of jati, of birth, of social position. You could believe that everyone was ultimately divine, while also believing that some people's current manifestation was so degraded, so polluted, that avoiding contact was necessary for spiritual self-preservation. The contradiction didn't need resolution. It simply was another paradox in a religion filled with paradoxes, and so the hierarchy persisted, generation after generation, century after century. The Brahmin's great-great-great-grandson would be a Brahmin, performing similar duties, enjoying similar privileges. The untouchable's great-great-great-grandson would be an untouchable, performing similar tasks, enduring similar degradations. The cosmic wheel turned, lifetimes accumulated, and the system reproduced itself with remarkable stability. Until, of course, it didn't. Until modernity arrived, bringing new ideas about human equality, about social justice, about the illegitimacy of inherited status, until the British colonial period disrupted traditional structures, sometimes intentionally, sometimes as a side effect of economic and political changes, until Indian reformers, many of them from high castes themselves, began questioning whether Dharma, as traditionally understood, was really just. Until the Constitution of independent India outlawed untouchability and guaranteed equality before the law. But that's modern history, and we're supposed to be getting you to sleep, not agitating you with contemporary social issues. So let us return to our Brahmin and our untouchable, living their lives in medieval India, each locked into a cosmic system that promised justice over infinite lifetimes while delivering profound inequality in the present. The Brahmin performs his evening prayers, chanting Sanskrit verses in his clean home, surrounded by symbols of learning and devotion. He eats his dinner, simple but adequate, served by his wife on a fresh banana leaf. He retires to his sleeping mat, comfortable, secure, confident in his place in the cosmic order. The untouchable finishes his day's labor, exhausted, aching, hungry. He eats his meager portion of coarse food, if there is food, sitting outside his hut because there's no room inside. He lies down on the ground, perhaps with a ragged cloth for covering, and stares at the same stars the Brahmin can see, the same moon, the same cosmos, the same divine reality that supposedly pervades all beings, high and low, pure and impure, privileged and degraded. Tomorrow, both will wake and perform their respective dharmas. The cosmic order will continue. The hierarchy will persist. And both, in their own ways, will believe, or at least accept, that this is how things should be, how they must be, how they have always been and will always be, world without end, until perhaps the end of this cosmic cycle and the beginning of the next, when perhaps things will be shuffled slightly, when the untouchable's future self might be born higher, and the Brahmin's future self might be born lower, karma working itself out across timescales so vast that a single human life is less than a heartbeat. Sleep now, grateful for the historical accident of when and where you were born, grateful that you live in an era and place where inherited pollution is not a real constraint, where cosmic hierarchy is not enforced by social custom and law, where you can eat what you want, walk where you want, associate with whom you want, without consulting ancient texts about ritual purity. The past is distant. The hierarchies that seemed so natural, so inevitable, so cosmically ordained to those who lived within them, now appear as what they always were: human constructs, social systems, power structures justified by theology, but serving very earthly interests. The privilege of the priests was real. The suffering of the untouchables was real. The cosmic justifications were, well, justifications, serving the same function that such justifications always serve, making inequality seem inevitable, natural, divinely ordained. But that was then, and this is now, and you are here, drifting toward sleep, free from those ancient constraints, those crushing obligations, those cosmic certainties that bounded life so narrowly and completely. Rest well, dreaming perhaps of temples and texts, of rituals and hierarchies, of the strange, distant world where religion wasn't something you did on weekends, but the very structure of existence itself, inescapable and all-encompassing. The gods, if they exist, are sleeping too. And so we arrive at the end of our nocturnal journey, through Hindu religious life, through temples and texts, through obligations and hierarchies, through a world so saturated with the sacred that the distinction between religious and secular simply didn't exist. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a temple servant, waking before dawn to bathe in cold water, performing endless rituals with perfect precision, standing for hours on stone floors, maintaining purity standards that would have seemed impossibly demanding. You wouldn't have thrived as a devout king, balancing cosmic duty with political necessity, performing rituals on behalf of entire kingdoms, judged not just by your success in war or governance, but by your adherence to Dharma, cosmic order that demanded far more than any human could perfectly fulfill. You would have been frustrated by the ancient texts, their meanings partially lost, their words perfectly preserved, but their contexts evaporated, generations of scholars arguing about what they meant, what they mean, whether meaning is even the right question to ask. And you would have been troubled, I hope, by the stark hierarchy between priests and untouchables, between cosmic privilege and inherited degradation, between a system that promised ultimate justice across lifetimes while delivering profound injustice in the present. But here's the strange thing. Billions of people have lived within this system, finding not just survival, but meaning, not just obligation, but genuine devotion, not just constraint, but community and purpose, and connection to something larger than themselves. The temple servant, exhausted though he was serving the divine. The devout king, burdened though he was maintaining cosmic order. The Brahmin priest, privileged though he was, genuinely believed in his responsibility to preserve sacred knowledge, to perform rituals correctly, to mediate between human and divine. Even the untouchable, degraded as his circumstances were, often participated in his own religious traditions, worshipped his own gods and goddesses, found moments of joy and meaning in festivals and family, in the small mercies of existence. The system was crushing, yes, but humans are extraordinarily resilient, extraordinarily capable of finding meaning, even in the most constrained circumstances. This doesn't justify the system. It doesn't excuse the cruelty, the degradation, the suffering inflicted in the name of cosmic order. But it does complicate the picture, reminds us that historical people were as fully human as we are, with the same capacity for love and joy and hope, even when their circumstances were incomprehensibly difficult by our standards. You live in a different world. You wake when you choose, or when your alarm chooses for you, but not to a bronze bell summoning you to serve gods you didn't select. You eat what appeals to you, without consulting texts about ritual purity. You associate with whom you wish, unconstrained by birth-determined boundaries. You can question religious authority, can adopt or discard beliefs, can craft your own spiritual path, or reject spirituality entirely. These freedoms, which seems so natural to you, would have appeared as chaos, as dangerous disorder, to most people throughout Hindu history. And yet, for all your freedom, you struggle with meaning, with purpose, with the question of what makes life worth living. The temple servant knew his purpose, knew his role, knew exactly what was expected of him, though the knowledge came at the cost of choice. You have choice, abundant choice, perhaps too much choice, and with it the burden of constructing meaning for yourself. Perhaps there's no resolution to this tension, no perfect balance between freedom and structure, between autonomy and belonging, between individual choice and cosmic order. Perhaps we're all just improvising, finding our way through existence as best we can, drawing on ancient wisdom and modern innovations, respecting traditions while questioning their limitations, grateful for what has been passed down while building something new. The Hindu religious life we've explored tonight is both distant and near, foreign and oddly familiar. Distant because the specifics, the purity rules, the caste boundaries, the ritual elaborations are so far from modern experience. Near because the underlying human experiences, seeking meaning, managing obligation, navigating hierarchies, wondering about ultimate reality, are eternal. Sleep now, with gratitude for hot showers and varied diets, for literacy and equality before the law, for the freedom to lie in bed listening to historical podcasts instead of waking to bronze bells. But sleep also with some appreciation, perhaps, for the extraordinary human ingenuity that created and maintained religious systems of such complexity, for the generations of priests who memorized thousands of verses, for the architects and artisans who built temples of breathtaking beauty, for the philosophers who pondered consciousness and reality and liberation. The past is past. Those people lived their lives, fulfilled or failed to fulfill their dharmas, were reborn or achieved liberation or simply ended, depending on what you believe about death and what comes after. Their struggles are over. Their obligations have been discharged or left incomplete. Their hierarchy has been challenged, dismantled in law if not entirely in practice, recognized as human construct rather than cosmic necessity. But they lived, fully and completely, within their moment, doing their best to navigate an existence that seemed as obvious and natural to them as yours seems to you. And, perhaps, in a few centuries, people will look back on our time with similar bemusement, wondering how we could have believed what we believed, structured our lives as we did, failed to question what seemed so obviously unjust to future eyes. The wheel turns. Circumstances change. Dharma evolves or gets reinterpreted or gets abandoned. And through it all, humans continue, waking, working, worshipping or not, seeking meaning or accepting meaninglessness, building elaborate systems of thought and practice to make sense of an existence that perhaps doesn't make sense, that perhaps doesn't need to make sense, that simply is. Rest now. Dream of temples if you must, or of nothing at all, which would be far better for sleep. Let the ancient world fade, let the hierarchies dissolve, let the obligations lift. You're here, in this moment, free to sleep without concern for purity, without rituals to perform, without cosmic order demanding your attention. The gods, if they're watching, surely won't mind. Good night.